If the law forced you to marry to keep your father's land, would you sign it away to the railroad? Or sign your fate into an unexpected marriage? Dawn crept through the oiled paper window like a thief, touching Sarah Whitmore's face with fingers of pale gold. The depot bell tolled 6 times across the quarter-mile of prairie grass that separated her claim from Millbrook Station. She counted each chime, a habit born of waiting for news that never came on time. The marriage scarf lay folded in the bottom drawer of her father's desk, red wool soft as prayer between her fingers. She'd woven it herself last autumn when the territorial agent had first mentioned the new regulations. Every homestead woman needed a husband's name on the deed come spring registration or forfeit the land to the railroad. 17 weeks, she whispered to the empty cabin, calculating time by the silver dollars in her flour tin. $17 saved from selling eggs to the stage depot, butter to the mill workers, preserves to anyone with coin to spare. At this rate, she'd have the $40 filing fee by summer if she could find a man willing to sign the papers and ask no questions after. The creek ran higher this morning, swollen with snowmelt from the Badlands 20 miles north. Sarah pulled on her father's old boots and stepped outside to check the water level against the willow stakes she'd driven into the bank last fall. The creek had risen 3 inches overnight. She marked it in her ledger. The 15th of March, 1890. Creek up 3. High water meant good grass meant more settlers. More settlers meant the railroad would push the junction through Millbrook instead of around it. Thomas Bearcloud emerged from the cottonwoods upstream, leading his grandfather's spotted horse to drink. He moved with the deliberate grace his people called walking in balance, each step placed with purpose. The horse nickered a greeting to Sarah's mule, who raised his head from the new grass with ears pricked forward. "Morning rises early today," Thomas said, his English careful and precise. He was about her age, maybe 25, with calloused hands that spoke of work and eyes that missed nothing. His grandfather was chief walking eagle of the small band Lakota, whose people had been granted the valley bottom in the Treaty of 85. "Water's running fast," Sarah replied, nodding toward the creek. "My stakes say 3 inches since yesterday." Thomas studied the muddy flow, then looked upstream toward the distant black line of storm clouds gathering above the Badlands. "Ice moves in the high country. My grandfather says this will be the year the valley remembers what it was before the white man's fences." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. She'd heard stories of spring floods, entire homesteads swept away when the winter's snow melted too fast in the mountains. Her cabin sat on high ground, but her fields lay in the creek bottom, the only soil rich enough to grow the wheat crop she needed to prove up her claim. "How long before it peaks?" she asked. Thomas shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both uncertainty and deep knowledge. "The ice knows its own time. Maybe 3 days, maybe 7. Depends how warm the sun burns and how hard the wind blows from the south." The depot bell chimed the half hour. 6:30. Sarah's pulse quickened. The eastbound stage arrived at 7 sharp every Monday, bringing mail, supplies, and sometimes passengers looking for land or work. This morning it would carry news from the territorial office word on whether the new homestead regulations would be enforced come registration time. "I need to get to the depot," she said, suddenly aware of the marriage scarf still clutched in her hand. Thomas's gaze fell on the red wool, and something shifted in his expression. "That is beautiful work," he said quietly. "My grandmother makes cloth like this, but not so fine. You have good hands for weaving." Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks. She stuffed the scarf into her coat pocket, embarrassed by her foolishness. Here she was, worried about finding a husband for her papers, when Thomas Bearcloud stood not 20 feet away, a man who knew the land, respected her work, and spoke to her as an equal. But the regulations were clear. Only marriages recognized by territorial law would satisfy the land office. And territorial law didn't recognize unions between white women and Indian men, no matter how good and decent those men might be. "Thank you," she managed. "I should go." "The stage." "Yes," Thomas said, understanding more than her words conveyed. "The stage brings changes. My grandfather will want to know what kind." He swung onto his horse with easy grace and touched his hat brim in farewell. Sarah watched him ride upstream toward the small cluster of lodges where the band made their winter camp, then hurried toward the depot, her father's boots squelching in the muddy grass. The creek gurgled and chuckled beside the path, 3 inches higher than yesterday, and rising with each hour the sun climbed higher in the clear spring sky. The Millbrook depot squatted beside the rail line like a wooden toad, painted yellow with green trim that had faded to the color of old grass. Sarah arrived as the stage rolled into view, a dust cloud marking its approach from the east. 7 passengers this morning, unusual for early March, and among them a man in a black suit who stepped down from the coach with the careful movements of someone who'd spent too many hours in uncomfortable seats. Postmaster Jenkins sorted the mail with practiced efficiency, calling out names as he distributed letters and packages. "Whitmore," he hollered, and Sarah stepped forward to claim a thick envelope bearing the territorial seal. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax. Inside, an official notice printed on heavy paper. Homestead Act Amendment, effective the 1st of April, 1890. All single women claiming homestead rights must provide proof of marriage or forfeit claims to railroad development. Registration period. April 1, 15. Filing fee, $40. No extensions granted. 2 weeks. Sarah folded the notice carefully and slipped it into her coat beside the marriage scarf. Around her, other homesteaders opened similar letters, their faces reflecting her own dismay. $40, muttered Pete Garrison, whose claim bordered hers to the south. Where's a man supposed to find $40 in March? Same place he finds a wife, I reckon, said his neighbor, earning bitter laughter from the small crowd. The man in the black suit approached the group with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Excuse me, folks. Name's Carlton Webb, representing the Dakota and Western Railroad. I couldn't help overhearing your concerns about the new regulations." Webb pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted several documents. "I'm authorized to make cash offers for any claims folks might be looking to sell. Fair market value, no questions asked. Money in your hands today." "How much?" Pete asked. "Depends on the land. Creek bottom goes for $8 an acre, high ground for $5. I can write a bank draft right here, right now." Webb's pen glinted gold in the morning light. Sarah calculated quickly. Her 160-acre claim would bring maybe $900 at those prices, more than twice what she had in savings, but less than a quarter of what the land would be worth once the railroad came through. And it would mean abandoning her father's grave, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the dream that had brought them west from Ohio 5 years ago. "I'll think on it," she said. Webb handed her a calling card. "Don't think too long, miss? Offers like this don't last forever." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah walked to the telegraph office beside the depot. The key clicked and chattered as the operator, a thin young man named Billy Morse, sent messages east. Sarah waited until he finished, then stepped forward. "I need to send a wire to Rapid City," she said. "To the territorial clerk's office." Billy prepared his key. "What's the message?" Sarah hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Sarah Whitmore, Millbrook Station. Request information marriage requirements, territorial law. Stop. Urgent. Stop." The message cost her 75 cents, nearly half a day's earnings, but she needed to know exactly what the law required. If there was any way to satisfy the regulations without actually finding a husband, she had to explore it. Back home, she found the creek had risen another inch while she was gone. The muddy water now lapped at the bottom rail of the fence around her vegetable garden. Sarah drove new stakes and marked the level, then walked the perimeter of her property to check for signs of erosion. Near the northwest corner, where her land abutted the Lakota camp, she found Thomas Bearcloud examining a deep gully that hadn't been there yesterday. Spring runoff had carved a channel 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, carrying away topsoil that had taken centuries to accumulate. "It's starting," he said, without looking up. "The water finds its old paths." Sarah knelt beside the gully, running her fingers through the rich black earth that lined its sides. "How bad will it get?" My grandfather's grandfather told stories of the Great Flood, when the whole valley ran like a river from bluff to bluff. That was 70 winters ago, maybe 80. The signs then were like the signs now: ice breaking early in the high country, warm wind from the south, and white men trying to fence the water. Fence the water? Thomas pointed upstream, where a wooden dam had been built across a tributary creek. The mill owner. He diverts water to turn his wheel, makes the creek run where he wants instead of where it needs to go. When the flood comes, that dam will break, and all the water he's been stealing will come back at once. Sarah felt the marriage scarf in her pocket, soft wool against her fingers. How long do we have? The ice will tell us. Maybe 2 days, maybe 5. Thomas stood, brushing dirt from his hands. My grandfather wants to speak with you. Tonight, if you will come. About the flood? About many things. The water, the railroad, the new laws. He says the spirits showed him a vision of change coming to the valley and that you would have a part in it. Sarah nodded, though the thought of visiting the Lakota camp after dark made her nervous. She traded with Thomas and his people for 3 years, but always in daylight, always with the social boundaries clearly maintained. Chief Walking Eagle was known as a wise and peaceful man, but these were dangerous times for anyone who crossed the invisible lines that separated white and Indian worlds. After sunset, she agreed. I'll bring coffee beans as a gift. Thomas smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him all morning. He will like that. Coffee is one of the white man's gifts he approves of. As he walked away, Sarah pulled out the marriage scarf and held it up to the light. The red wool seemed to glow like embers in the afternoon Sunday. Somewhere upstream, ice groaned and cracked in the warming air, and the creek sang its rising song as it carried the winter's melt toward the valley below. 2 weeks until registration. Less than $100 saved toward the filing fee. And now a flood coming that could wash away everything she'd worked to build. But tonight she would speak with Chief Walking Eagle and perhaps find answers to questions she was only beginning to know how to ask. The creek rose another half-inch while she watched, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled from a sky still blue as cornflowers. Midpoint. The belonging. Choice. The Lakota camp lay in a natural hollow beside the creek. 7 lodges arranged in a circle around a central fire. Sarah approached on foot, leading her mule and carrying a cloth bag of coffee beans she'd been saving for special occasions. The sun had set an hour ago, and firelight danced orange against the lodge skins. Chief Walking Eagle sat beside the largest lodge, wrapped in a blanket that might once have been blue but had faded to the color of twilight. He was smaller than Sarah had expected, perhaps 60 years old, with silver-threaded braids and eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of all his winters. Thomas rose from beside his grandfather and gestured for Sarah to approach. Grandfather, this is Sarah Whitmore, the weaver who keeps the creek bottom. Walking Eagle studied her for a long moment, then spoke in Lakota. Thomas translated. He says, you have your father's stubbornness, but your mother's heart. He knew your father traded horses with him before the sickness took him. Sarah knelt and offered the coffee beans. Tell him I'm honored by his invitation. The old chief accepted the gift with grave courtesy, then gestured for her to sit. He spoke again, longer this time, his voice carrying the rhythm of formal speech. He says the spirits have shown him a vision, Thomas interpreted. White soldiers coming from the east, railroad men from the south, and water from the north. All 3 will arrive together, and when they do, the old agreements will be forgotten. He asks if you have seen the same signs. Sarah thought of Carlton Webb's offer, the new homestead regulations, the rising creek. The railroad wants to buy our land cheap before the flood comes. They know something we don't. Walking Eagle nodded when Thomas translated, then spoke directly to Sarah in careful English. You understand? Good. Now, I tell you what the spirits showed me. He picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt beside the fire. Here is our camp. Here is your cabin. Here is the depot and the mill. When the flood comes, he swept his hand across the drawing, erasing half the lines. The water will run where it ran in my grandfather's time. The mill dam will break. The depot will flood. The rail line will be underwater for 7 days. Sarah felt her throat tighten. And my cabin? Safe. Your father chose high ground, but your fields. Walking Eagle shook his head. My wheat crop. Without it, I can't prove up my claim. Yes, but the railroad men know this. They wait for the flood to wash away the small farms, then buy the land for nothing. The old chief looked up from his drawing. Unless. He drew a new line in the dirt, connecting his camp to Sarah's cabin. There is another way. Lakota law and white law both honor marriage bonds, but in different ways. If you were to bind yourself to my grandson, not in the white man's church, but in the old way, the Lakota claim would protect your land from the railroad. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't understand. Thomas leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. Under the Treaty of 85, married women of the tribe retain property rights through their husband's tribal status. If we were wed by Lakota ceremony, your land would become part of the tribal holding. The railroad couldn't touch it, but would territorial law recognize? The territorial governor signed the treaty, Walking Eagle said. It has the force of federal law, stronger than the homestead regulations. Sarah pulled the marriage scarf from her pocket, the red wool seeming to pulse with firelight. This was meant for someone else. A white man who would sign papers to help me keep my claim. Walking Eagle reached out and touched the scarf, running the wool between weathered fingers. You made this with your own hands? Yes. Then you made it for the right purpose, even if you didn't know it yet. The old chief smiled. In our tradition, when a woman weaves a marriage cloth with her own hands, she weaves her heart into it. The cloth chooses its own destiny. Thomas spoke softly. Grandfather, the white world won't accept. The white world is changing, Walking Eagle interrupted. Soon there will be no more treaties, no more tribal holdings, no more old ways. But today, the old ways can still protect what matters. The question is whether this woman has the courage to trust them. Sarah looked at Thomas, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as the Indian from the neighboring camp, but as a man who knew her work, respected her struggles, spoke to her as an equal. A man who could read the weather in cloud formations and water levels, who understood both the old ways and the new. If we did this, she said carefully, what would it mean? For both of us? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. It would mean I could help you save your land, and perhaps, it would mean you could help me save something too. What? My grandfather's stories. The history of our people in this valley. Someone needs to write them down before the old men die and the young ones forget. You have the education for it, and the understanding of how both worlds work. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like ice breaking free in a spring creek. Here was belonging she hadn't dared hope, for not just marriage papers to satisfy the law, but partnership built on mutual need and growing respect. The ceremony, she said. What would it involve? Walking Eagle smiled, his eyes crinkling with something that might have been relief. Simple. We bind your hands with the marriage cloth you made. You share water from the creek that feeds both our lands. You speak vows that honor both the earth and each other. Then you are wed in the sight of the spirits and the law. When? Tomorrow night, before the flood comes. The spirits prefer marriages made under pressure. They last longer. Sarah stood, the marriage scarf clutched in her hands. The choice felt enormous and simple at the same time, like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. Yes, she said. Yes, if Thomas agrees. Thomas rose and faced her, his expression serious but not unkind. I have watched you for 3 years, Sarah Whitmore. You work like a Lakota woman with respect for the land and determination to thrive. I would be honored to call you wife, in whatever way lets you keep what your father built. Walking Eagle clapped his hands once, sharply. Good. Then tomorrow we make the binding and see what the flood brings after. As Sarah walked home through the darkness, the marriage scarf warm in her hands, she felt the creek rising beside the path an inch higher than this morning, singing its ancient song of change and renewal. Tomorrow night she would bind her fate to Thomas Bear Cloud's, trusting in laws older than the territorial government and deeper than the railroad's greed. Behind her, the campfire flickered against the lodge skins, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled promise of the storm to come. Sarah woke to the sound of rain drumming on her cabin roof and water rushing louder than before in the creek. Dawn came grey and muted, filtered through storm clouds that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. When she checked her water stakes, she found the creek had risen 4 inches overnight. The folded marriage papers lay on her kitchen table beside the territorial notice, both documents somehow seeming less important in the face of what she'd agreed to last night. By sunset today, she would be married, not in the way she'd always imagined, with a white dress and church bells, but bound by older laws to a man who understood the language of water and weather. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Billy Morse from the telegraph office, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Wire for you, Miss Whitmore." "Came in this morning from Rapid City." Sarah tipped him a quarter and opened the yellow telegram with shaking hands. Territorial Clerk. "Rapid City to Whitmore Millbrook. Stop marriage requirements. Territorial law require church or civil ceremony. White officials only stop tribal marriages, not recognized for homestead purposes. Stop registration, deadline firm. Stop." Her heart sank. The Lakota ceremony might protect her land from the railroad through treaty law, but it wouldn't satisfy the homestead regulations. She'd still need $40 and a husband recognized by territorial authorities, or lose her claim to the government. Rain hammered harder against the windows as Sarah sat at her table, staring at the 3 pieces of paper that held her future. The homestead notice, the territorial wire, and her father's original land patent. There had to be a solution she wasn't seeing, some way to thread the needle between competing laws and requirements. Another knock, this one more urgent. Thomas Bearcloud stood on her porch, water streaming from his long coat. "The dam broke," he said without preamble. "An hour ago. The flood is coming faster than my grandfather predicted." Sarah grabbed her coat and followed him outside. Even in the rain, she could see the creek had transformed from a gentle stream into a brown torrent that filled the channel bank to bank. Debris rushed past tree branches, fence posts, what looked like part of someone's roof. "How long until it peaks?" she shouted over the noise of wind and water. "Tonight? Maybe sooner. The mill is already flooded. Part of the depot, too." Thomas paused, rain streaming down his face. "There's something else. The railroad men are at my grandfather's camp. They claim the tribal treaty is void because of the new federal regulations. Can they do that? They have soldiers with them, blue coats from Fort McKinney." Thomas's expression was grim. "My grandfather sent me to ask, do you still want to go through with the ceremony? It might not protect either of us now." Sarah looked downstream toward the depot, where she could see tiny figures moving around the yellow building. Carlton Webb and his men, no doubt, ready to snap up flood-damaged claims for pennies on the dollar. The marriage scarf felt heavy in her coat pocket. "The ceremony might not save our land," she said slowly, "but it might save something else. Your grandfather's stories, the history of your people here. If we're married, I have a legal claim to be the keeper of tribal records. They can't take that away, even if they void the treaty." Thomas studied her face, searching for something. "You would do this? Give up your homestead dream to help preserve our history?" "Maybe I'm not giving it up. Maybe I'm changing what it means." Sarah pulled out the marriage scarf, its red wool bright against the grey morning. "This valley has been home to your people for generations. If I'm going to belong here, really belong, I need to understand its whole story." A new sound cut through the storm, the sharp blast of a train whistle from the direction of the depot. Sarah and Thomas looked at each other, then ran for higher ground to see what was happening. A locomotive sat on the tracks beside the flooded depot, black smoke mixing with the storm clouds. As they watched, uniformed soldiers began unloading equipment and supplies. Carlton Webb stood beside the train in animated conversation with an officer in blue. "They're not waiting for the flood to end," Thomas said. "They're taking the land now, while people are distracted by the emergency." Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, hotter than fear. "Then we don't wait either. Can the ceremony be performed this afternoon instead of tonight?" "If my grandfather agrees." But Sarah Thomas caught her arm as she turned to go. "Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be married to an Indian man. In 1890, Dakota territory. The white world won't forgive that easily. Sarah looked down at the marriage scarf in her hands, remembering the long winter evenings she'd spent weaving it by lamplight, dreaming of a future that suddenly seemed small and constrained compared to what Thomas was offering. Then I guess I'll have to make a new world, she said, one that's big enough for both of us. Thunder rolled overhead as they hurried toward the Lakota camp, the creek rising with each step they took. By the time they reached Walking Eagle's lodge, water was lapping at the edges of the camp's traditional circle. The old chief listened to their report with growing gravity, then spoke briefly in Lakota to the other adults who had gathered. When he turned back to Sarah, his expression was resolved. "We perform the ceremony now," he said in English. "Before the soldiers come, before the water drives us from our homes. If this is to be the end of the old ways, let them end with honor." The rain slackened as the camp prepared for the wedding. Sarah helped the women arrange a circle of stones around a small fire, while Thomas and the other men sang traditional songs in voices that seemed to call the very spirits from the storm clouds. Walking Eagle produced a water gourd carved with symbols Sarah didn't recognize, but somehow understood symbols of continuity, of belonging, of roots that ran deeper than any government's authority. "The ceremony will be brief," the chief told her as the others took their places around the fire. "We bind your hands, you drink from the gourd, you speak your promises. Then you are wed in the sight of our ancestors and yours." Sarah nodded, clutching the marriage scarf. Through the rain, she could see the brown flood rushing past, carrying away pieces of the world she'd known. But here, in this circle of stones, surrounded by people who understood what it meant to lose everything and still endure, she felt something she'd never experienced before, the bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The depot whistle blew again in the distance, sharp and urgent against the storm. But here, by the sacred fire, with her hand extended toward Thomas Bearcloud and the red marriage scarf waiting to bind their fates together, Sarah Whitmore prepared to step across the threshold into a future none of them could predict, but all of them would face together. The Lakota wedding circle formed as the storm reached its peak. 7 adults standing around the fire while rain drummed against the earth and the creek roared past 20 yards away. Walking Eagle held the water gourd in hands that shook slightly, not from age, Sarah realized, but from the weight of conducting perhaps the last traditional ceremony his band would ever perform in this valley. "Join hands," the chief instructed. Sarah placed her palm against Thomas's, feeling the calluses earned from years of honest work. His grip was steady and warm, anchoring her as Walking Eagle began wrapping the marriage scarf around their joined wrists. The red wool settled into place like a promise made flesh. "This woman and this man choose each other," Walking Eagle said in English, then repeated the words in Lakota. "They choose the hard path of 2 worlds, the courage to build something new from something old." He lifted the water gourd. "This water comes from the creek that feeds both your lands. Drink, and be bound by what you share." Sarah sipped first, tasting earth and rain and the mineral essence of the Badlands. Thomas drank after her, his eyes never leaving her face. When he lowered the gourd, Walking Eagle began to speak in the formal cadence of ceremony. "Say your promises now, before the spirits and your people." Thomas spoke first, his voice carrying clearly over the storm. "Sarah Whitmore, I promise to stand with you against whatever changes come to this valley. I promise to help you tend the land your father loved and to share with you the stories my grandfather taught me. I promise to be your partner in the old ways and the new." Sarah's throat tightened as she found her words. "Thomas Bearcloud, I promise to learn your people's history and help preserve it for the generations coming. I promise to respect the land we share and the traditions that have protected it. I promise to be your wife in whatever world we make together." Walking Eagle began unwrapping the scarf, but instead of removing it entirely, he retied it in a complex pattern that left both their hands partially bound. "Wear this until the sun sets," he instructed. "Then you are truly wed. And no law of white men or red can separate what the spirits have joined." A shout erupted from the direction of the depot. Through the rain, Sarah could see soldiers marching toward the camp, led by Carlton Webb and a blue-coated officer. They moved with purpose, clearly intent on reaching the ceremony before it concluded. "They're coming," Thomas said quietly. Walking Eagle's weathered face hardened. Let them come. They cannot stop what is already finished in the sight of heaven. The soldiers splashed through the rising water, their boots squelching in the muddy ground. Webb arrived first, his city clothes soaked and muddy, his civilized veneer cracking. "Stop this ceremony," he commanded. "By order of the territorial government, this gathering is illegal." The blue-coated officer stepped forward, a captain, Sarah noted, with the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Captain Morrison, Fort McKinney. This camp is being evacuated for your own safety. The flood poses an immediate danger." Walking Eagle rose slowly, drawing himself up to his full height. Though small in stature, he suddenly seemed to fill the space around the fire. "We have lived with this creek for more generations than your people have been on this continent, Captain. We know when water is dangerous and when it is merely enthusiastic. Nevertheless, you'll need to move to higher ground. The railroad is providing temporary shelter at the depot." "The depot is underwater," Thomas pointed out. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened. "Then you'll move to wherever we designate. This is not a request." Sarah felt the marriage scarf binding her wrist to Thomas's, still damp from the rain but warming against her skin. The ceremony was complete according to Lakota law, but she could see in Webb's predatory smile that he understood the legal complexities as well as she did. A tribal marriage might protect some rights, but it wouldn't satisfy the homestead regulations or stop the railroad from claiming the land through other means. "Captain," she said, stepping forward with Thomas beside her, "I'm a legal homesteader with a valid claim registered under territorial law. My property is not being evacuated, and I'm not leaving without a court order." Webb laughed harshly. "Your property, Miss Whitmore? According to our records, you're an unmarried woman who can't meet the new registration requirements. Your claim reverts to the territory in 3 days unless you can produce both a husband and $40 in filing fees. Then it's fortunate I have both." Sarah reached into her coat and pulled out the folded marriage papers, the official territorial forms she'd been saving for a white husband who would never come. With deliberate movements, she unfolded the documents on a flat stone beside the fire. "Thomas Bearcloud, as my lawfully wedded husband under tribal authority recognized by the Treaty of 1885, will you sign these papers to satisfy the territorial requirements?" Thomas stared at her for a moment, then smiled, a genuine expression of admiration and something deeper. "I will sign them gladly, wife." Captain Morrison stepped forward. "Those papers require a white witness and a filing fee. I have both." Sarah reached into her other pocket and pulled out her savings, not the $17 she'd counted yesterday, but $39.50, including the money she'd borrowed against her future egg sales and the emergency funds she'd kept hidden in her father's desk. As for a witness, she looked directly at the captain. "You're a federal officer, sworn to uphold all laws, including treaty obligations. You can witness the signing." Webb's face went red. "This is ridiculous. The territorial government won't recognize. The territorial government will recognize whatever a federal officer certifies as legal," Sarah interrupted. "Captain Morrison, you took an oath to defend the Constitution. The Treaty of 1885 is constitutional law, and this marriage is valid under its terms." The captain looked from Sarah to Thomas to the official papers spread on the stone. Around them, the other Lakota watched silently, their faces grave but hopeful. The rain had slackened to a steady drizzle, and the creek seemed to be holding at its current level instead of rising further. "The document appears to be in order," Morrison said finally. "And if the marriage is valid under federal treaty law," he pulled out a pen from his uniform jacket, "I can witness the signing." Webb started to protest, but Morrison cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Mr. Webb, your railroad has rights under territorial law, but federal treaty law supersedes territorial regulations. If this marriage is legally valid, and it appears to be, then these homestead rights transfer to the husband under tribal authority." Thomas signed his name in careful script, his hand steady despite the momentous nature of the act. Sarah added her signature below his, then counted out the filing fee in silver coins. Captain Morrison witnessed both signatures with military precision, then helped Sarah fold the papers and seal them with wax from the ceremonial candle. "There," Sarah said, facing Webb with her chin raised. Legal marriage, signed papers, filing fee paid. Federal witness. My claim stands. Webb's expression promised future trouble, but he had no immediate legal recourse. After a tense moment, he gestured to his men and began retreating toward the depot. This isn't over, he called back. The railroad has other options. Captain Morrison lingered a moment longer. Ma'am, I hope you know what you're doing. There are going to be consequences for this choice. There are consequences for every choice, Captain. I'm choosing the ones I can live with. As the soldiers departed, Walking Eagle began redistributing the sacred fire's coals to smaller fires that could be easily moved if the water rose further. The ceremony was complete, the papers filed, the marriage consummated in law, if not yet in flesh. Sarah looked down at the marriage scarf still binding her wrist to Thomas's, the red wool darkened by rain but holding firm. The storm was passing. She realized the thunder had moved east, and patches of blue sky showed between the breaking clouds. The water is stopping its rise, Thomas observed, nodding toward the creek. My grandfather was right about the timing. Walking Eagle smiled, banking the last of the coals in a clay pot. The spirits favor marriages made under pressure. This one will endure whatever storms come after. A new sound reached them from the depot, not the sharp whistle of the locomotive, but the slower, deeper horn of a riverboat. Sarah shaded her eyes against the brightening sky and saw an impossible sight. A shallow, draft steamer picking its way upstream through the flood, its paddle wheel churning against the current. Who would bring a boat up this creek? She wondered aloud. Thomas grinned. Someone with cargo too valuable to wait for the railroad. Look at the flag. Sarah looked and laughed despite everything. The boat flew the territorial mail service pennant. This was the emergency postal delivery, bringing the mail that couldn't wait for trains or stages, which meant the marriage papers, she breathed. If we can get them on that boat, they'll reach the territorial office before the deadline. They ran for the creek bank, still bound together by the marriage scarf. The boat's captain saw them coming and steered closer to shore, his crew preparing to throw a line. You folks need passage downstream, the captain called. We're making an emergency run to Rapid City territorial business. We need to file homestead papers, Sarah called back. Legal deadline is tomorrow. Cost you $5 passage, another $5 for express filing. Sarah counted out the coins without hesitation, $10 that would leave her savings dangerously low, but this was why she'd saved every penny. The boat crew threw a rope ladder over the side. We have to go now, Thomas said quietly. Together. Are you ready for that? Sarah looked back at the Lakota camp, where Walking Eagle and the others were preparing to move to higher ground. Then she looked at her own cabin, sitting safely above the flood on the land her father had chosen with such care. Both places were home now, and both would be here when she returned. I'm ready, she said, and climbed aboard the mail boat with her husband's hand in hers. The territorial office in Rapid City occupied a limestone building that had been built to impress and intimidate. Sarah and Thomas climbed its steps as the late afternoon sun broke free of the last storm clouds, their marriage papers clutched in Sarah's free hand. The red scarf still bound their wrists. They had agreed not to remove it until sunset, as Walking Eagle had instructed. The clerk behind the registration desk was a thin man with spectacles who looked up with barely concealed impatience when they approached. Office closes at 5 o'clock, he announced. No exceptions. We're here to file homestead registration papers, Sarah said, placing the documents on his desk. We have the fee and all required signatures. The clerk examined the papers with the thoroughness of a man looking for reasons to reject them. He checked the signatures against official records, counted the filing fee twice, and read every line of the marriage certificate with obvious skepticism. This says you were married under tribal authority, he said finally. Territorial law requires. Federal treaty law supersedes territorial regulations, Thomas interrupted. The marriage was witnessed by Captain Morrison, Fort McKinney, as noted in his signature. The clerk looked up sharply, recognizing the authority of a federal military witness. After another long moment, he pulled out the official registration book and began copying information from their papers. Registration accepted. he said reluctantly, stamping the papers with unnecessary force. Your homestead claim is valid for 1 year, subject to standard improvement requirements. Outside on the courthouse steps, Sarah and Thomas sat in the late sunshine and watched the sun sink toward the western horizon. Around them, the city went about its evening, business merchants closing their shops, families heading home for supper, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing unchanged. When the sun touches the horizon, Thomas said, my grandfather's ceremony will be complete. We'll be married in every way that matters. Sarah studied his profile against the golden light. Are you sorry? About how it happened, I mean. Not the way either of us imagined finding a spouse. Thomas was quiet for a moment. My grandmother always said the best marriages begin with necessity and grow into something greater. She and my grandfather were promised to each other by their families, but they learned to love what they had built together. And do you think, could we build something like that? Thomas turned to meet her eyes. Sarah, I have watched you for 3 years. I have seen how you treat the land, how you face difficulties, how you speak, honestly, even when the truth is hard. If I had to choose a wife from all the women in Dakota Territory, I would choose you. The sun touched the horizon, flooding the prairie with red and gold light that matched the color of the marriage scarf. Sarah felt the moment settle into her bones like a promise kept. Then we should probably learn each other's given names, she said with a smile. I mean our real names, the ones our grandmothers used. Thomas is my white name for dealing with officials and storekeepers. My Lakota name is Mato Najin Standing Bear. He paused. And Sarah? Sarah is what my father called me, but my mother's name for me was Susanna. It means lily, something that grows beautiful in unlikely places. Susanna, Thomas repeated, as if tasting the word. I like that better. It suits you. The sun slipped below the horizon, and Thomas began unwrapping the marriage scarf from their joined wrists. The red wool had left faint impressions on their skin marks that would fade, but which somehow felt permanent in their significance. There, he said softly. Now we are wed in every law that governs this territory. Sarah folded the scarf carefully, reverently. What happens now? I mean, practically. Do you move to my cabin, or do I come to the camp? Or, we make it up as we go, Thomas said. My grandfather's band will probably move north for the summer to the reservation lands, but I can stay, help you rebuild after the flood, plant the crops we'll need for next year's proof of residence. And this winter? This winter, you teach me to read and write English better than I do now. I teach you Lakota history and the stories my grandfather once preserved. We figure out how to be married people in a world that doesn't quite know what to make of us yet. Sarah stood and brushed dust from her dress, then offered Thomas her hand, freely given now, not bound by ceremony or necessity. Well then, husband, shall we go home? Thomas took her hand and rose beside her. Yes, wife. Let's go home. They walked toward the depot where the evening train would take them back to Millbrook Station, back to the flooded valley where two different worlds had met and made something new. Behind them, the marriage scarf rested in Sarah's coat pocket, red as sunset, soft as hope, strong as the promises that would carry them through whatever seasons lay ahead. The creek would recede, the railroad would come, and the world would continue changing around them. But tonight, Susanna Whitmore Bearcloud and her husband would return to the land they had chosen to defend together and begin the long work of building a life that honored both the old ways and the new. 3 months later, Sarah stood in her doorway watching Thomas split kindling in the early morning light. The creek ran clear and low in its proper channel, the flood damage repaired, the fields replanted with wheat that was already knee-high in the rich silt the waters had left behind. A rider approached from the direction of the depot, Billy Morse, carrying the mail pouch and a telegram yellow envelope that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Good news or bad came by wire in the territories, rarely anything in between. Mrs. Bearcloud, Billy called, using her married name with the careful politeness of a young man still adjusting to social changes. Wire from the territorial capital. Sarah tipped him and opened the telegram. Homestead. Claim. Whitmore. Bearcloud approved. Stop. Deed granted in perpetuity. Stop. Congratulations. Stop. She read it twice to be sure, then called to Thomas, who set down his hatchet and came to read over her shoulder. "It's done," she said, still hardly believing it. "The land is ours, really ours." Thomas smiled and pulled her close. "Our children will grow up here then, and their children after them. First, we have to have children." "Well," Thomas said, his eyes dancing with mischief, "we've been married 3 months. Perhaps it's time we worked on that project with the same determination we brought to saving the homestead." Sarah blushed and swatted his shoulder, but didn't pull away from his embrace. Through the open cabin door, she could see the kitchen table where she'd been writing down Walking Eagle stories in a careful ledger book, tales of the valley before the white settlers came, of the great flood 70 winters ago, of the treaties and promises and the long history of adaptation and survival. The marriage scarf lay folded in the bottom drawer of her father's desk, preserved like a sacred relic. She took it out sometimes in the evenings, remembering the storm and the soldiers and the moment when she'd chosen to trust in laws older than governments and deeper than fear. "Billy," she called to the telegraph operator, who was preparing to ride on to the next homestead. "Wait a moment. I have a message to send." She sat at the kitchen table and wrote carefully. "Walking Eagle, Lakota Band. Millbrook, stop. Stories preserved. Stop. Land safe. Stop. Come home when ready. Stop. Susanna." The old chief and his people had spent the summer months on the northern reservation, waiting to see if the railroad and the territorial government would honor the agreements made in the aftermath of the flood. Sarah's message would tell him that some promises, at least, were worth keeping. As Billy rode away with the telegram, Sarah returned to Thomas's side. He had resumed his work, splitting kindling, each stroke of the hatchet marking the rhythm of domestic life, the quiet victories that came after the dramatic ones, the daily choices that built a marriage stick by stick, story by story. "The railroad will come eventually," Thomas said, pausing in his work. "Webb wasn't lying about that. This valley is too valuable to leave alone forever." "Let it come," Sarah replied. "We'll be ready. We know how to adapt." She looked out over the fields where her wheat grew strong in the flood-enriched soil, then up at the cabin her father had built with such hope and vision. Both legacies would endure. She realized his dream of prosperity through honest work, and the older dreams Walking Eagle had shared with her of a people who could bend without breaking, who could find ways to preserve what mattered most, even as the world transformed around them. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the prairie grass and filling the air with the scent of growing things. Somewhere upstream, a meadowlark called its liquid song. And in the kitchen of the cabin that had sheltered 3 different kinds of hope, a ledger book lay open to a page that began, "In the time before the railroad, when the creek knew its own name, the stories would be preserved, the land would endure, and 2 people who had found each other in the midst of crisis would spend the rest of their lives learning what it meant to choose love deliberately, daily, in a world that demanded nothing less than complete courage from those who dared to build something new." If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.